I was going to speak more about relationalism, and then Monica said, "Why don't you also draw your own project into it?" And I think so. It's going to be a bit of both, but I'm going to actually use what we did in this project to illustrate what I think might be some ideas about relational methodology. So we've talked a lot about relational in many different ways, but we actually we haven't really centered on any kind of discussion about what we mean by the term. And sometimes it's used politically, sometimes analytically, but methodologically, I think it's also something for us to sort of think about. And this project, very quickly, is a project that just concluded last year. It's a collaborative project looking at gendered violence and urban transformation in two cities in Gurgaon in India, which is part of Delhi National Capital Region, and Johannesburg in South Africa. I had many collaborators. I want to thank all of them. Whatever I'm saying today is really seriously kind of collaborative work. And that collaborative work, incidentally, allowed us to really adopt what I think was a truly relational approach. And I think that's something for us to also think about. And I also want to connect in the talk relationality and intersectionality, because I think we've been talking a lot about race and caste as big categories, but I just think something, what we did in this project, almost even unwittingly through the research, broke down those categories quite a bit and allowed us to bring gender and class and race and caste in very interesting ways. So I want to just make one observation, because I was going to draw on Sylvia Joan Goldberg's distinction between comparison and relationalism. And I'm not 100% sure that I agree with all of what he's saying. I understand that a relational approach, from what he's saying, is something that looks at effects of historical, political, and cultural links rather than proceeding by analogy. But I think that's a slight caricature of the comparative method, because there are many comparative methods. Some are drawn from a more positivist tradition. Many are drawn from a more historical and anti-positivist tradition. So I think it's just to set this up here. The second distinction between nation, the caging of phenomena in nation states, which we all agree is problematic, but taking that to the global is also problematic, because the term global is also a little bit of an empty signifier. What do we actually mean when we say that? And I think that actually what we've done a little bit in the project is a kind of deep historical contextualization of what is a quote unquote global phenomenon, gendered violence. I mean, if you look at the statistics, they say 1 in 3 women are affected by gendered violence. And we know this is hugely underreported. The statistic itself is very problematic, because it suggests that we actually even know and that we can quantify something like this. So when we take something as global like that, but when we break it down into a more intersectional analysis, we see something quite interesting, I think, anyway. So the approach we adopted in the project was to take these two big nation states that have the dubious distinction of having the two big rape capitals in the world. Okay, so we took this very kind of colonial metaphor about sort of these problematic third world regions, but with where the data does show very high levels of gendered violence, and we brought it down to the level of the urban, to just focus in on areas of these two countries that are considered part of the BRICS countries that are in rapid flux, where gender, caste, class, and racialized relations are in rapid flux. And we thought what we wanted to do was to bring to the fore an intersectional and critical approach to studying what is this phenomenon, what is this construct actually, underneath it. Now, the approach was relational in the sense that we broke down the city further. We brought it down further to researching neighborhoods and particular areas of these neighborhoods. So within Johannesburg, we did ethnographic and sort of deep interview work in Alex and Sandton. Alex is a township, very poor, and it has been historically so through the apartheid and post-apartheid period, whereas Sandton is a bit like Gurgaon, which is a sort of site of multinational investment, very wealthy suburbs. with private security, and very much like what we saw in Delhi, where Gurgaon is the site of multinational investment, very wealthy, middle-class formations, juxtaposed with, peri-urban, much more deprived neighborhoods. So in this way of actually looking at these multiple and highly related, because obviously these are not separate spaces, the poorer neighborhoods service the rich neighborhoods through the provision of labor, and it is not just that the fact that this is about the provision of labor or actual material exchanges and relations, but also imaginaries. And that one of the things that we examined was how do women narrate their experiences of violence in these different spaces? What is the everyday lived experience of women in these spaces? But also, how do the multiplicity of actors in these different spaces construct violence? How do they understand? What is their understanding of violence? And where do they understand violence taking place, and to whom and by whom? So we took violence as a construct that was made possible by multiple situated actors. Okay, so one thing that I think this allowed us to see was that rather than looking at sort of majority of the literature, especially when you go into the global south, really tries to correlate gendered violence with poverty, deprivation, and sort of material factors. I mean, some surveys will try to find other things, but generally there is a kind of, there's a typecasting that happens, and we wanted to bring the symbolic elements of how this violence is also understood and constructed. And we looked at the misrecognitions that us produce, the fact that actually particular castes feel that it is other castes that are the ones that are committing the violence, or that violence is understood as being committed by poorer Black men in the townships, right? Not true at all. So one of the things that we actually looked at was very salient to the project was also looking at gendered violence in middle-class neighborhoods in both Johannesburg and Delhi, so as to counteract this type of, even if it's hidden, sort of assumptions. So I don't want to move. I'm not doing a PowerPoint presentation. I just wanted to put this there to let you know that I'm not doing a PowerPoint presentation. Yeah, sorry. I just wanted to let you know that this is the project. We're kind of meant to say that this is like funded by the, whenever we present. So I'm doing due diligence on all of this stuff. Okay, so one of the things about weaving these different scales together while grounding our data and ethnographic methods in interviews allowed us to do was to, as I said already, actually look at the narratives across the sharp social inequalities. And we find that the more voluble and prominent instances of violence are typically focused on deprived neighborhoods, and it skews our understanding of violence as a whole, which has been generally avoided in the literature. So now, the second point I want to make about relationality is that it's intimately, I think, connected to an intersectional method. When we looked at post-apartheid South Africa, when we took South Africa as a sort of one of the things I just want to say to you very briefly is when we were early on in the project, a number of prominent feminists said, what's apartheid got to do with gender violence? And we took that as a provocation because actually this is the global, if it's a global phenomenon, what does apartheid have to do with gender violence? And so this became important to think through, and I know that a lot of South African feminists have shown, particularly by looking at the police and the continuities in the police, the way the methods of policing neighborhoods in South Africa, that there are huge post-apartheid continuities. But they're not just in terms of the policing or the institutions, they're also there in the imaginations of post-apartheid South Africa. So even while physical spaces are demarcated as some as being new and developed, others as being underdeveloped and backward, there is a lot of movement. So there's the Black economic empowerment, which was something that was initiated by the African National Congress, created a Black middle class. The Black middle class has moved from Alex and neighborhoods like Alex into Sandton. And Sandton is now not not predominantly a white neighborhood. It's a mixed neighborhood with a lot of quite wealthy Black South Africans. And so there's, on the one hand, there's a racial imaginary that still continues to divide Alex and Santon, but it's doing so through the prism of class. Basically, there is still a sense that Black South Africans have arrived into Santon, they have moved away, and the majority of the South Africans who've been left behind in Alex are the ones who are perpetuating a lot of the violence. So the larger category of race has kind of become much more differentiated in terms of how gender is connected to that. So one thing I wanted to say is that in South Africa, there's a kind of this post-liberation South Africa is understood as a rainbow nation where, you do not have to be in Santon. I'm quoting Achille Membe here. You do not have to be in Santon. The adverts are playing on the elements of desirability, accessibility, and opportunity. And through acquiring these products, the youth want to be seen as connected and as beautiful. And I think this aspirational and sort of the desirability is one of the things that also often fuels gendered violence, because it's seen, the bridge between Alex and Santon is seen as something that you want to cross by actually either entering relationships with more wealthy men and trying to actually move oneself up if there were no other methods of doing that. In Gurgaon, we saw something very similar. So this is sort of the relational methodology worked within South Africa and within India, but it also allowed us, when we were seeing what was happening in South Africa, we started to look at similar sort of phenomena in India, but in a different way. Here, it is the different castes that have produced narratives about gendered violence. So the dominant castes, the Jats and the Yadavs, who felt that they were displaced by these kind of middle class, westernized middle classes, they think they're the ones who are bringing new ideals of like immodesty and westernization, and they're the ones who are fueling this kind of clash of cultures. Whereas if you speak to the wealthy middle class men and women, they feel that it's the backward castes, who are, their patriarchal attitudes are what's fueling gendered violence. What I want to point out here is that actually what's happening here is these are all mutually constructing what I think is an articulation of violence, in which what actually happens is that paternalism becomes a means of controlling women. So, no one's really talking about what's really happening, but what this construct engenders or makes possible is a reinforced paternalistic social control of women. And this is kind of completely, sort of in a sense, the paradox, which is that the misrecognitions and the deflections that are produced in these contexts of social inequality reinforce the social control of women. So, I know that I only have 5 minutes left. I'm just going to say very quickly that, the effect of that is that in Gurgaon, women, the lines of spatial safety are drawn very well, very tightly for women, and they have to be, the understanding is they have to have male guardians at all times to navigate the city. That's not true in South Africa. I think what we saw in Johannesburg instead is, in particular, Black South African middle class women were seen as, if they went to the police, they're seen as being spoiled or, overprivileged, and they're urged to buy their security. So the sort of neoliberal resolution of this problem is to buy surveillance technology, private security, and so forth. So in the two different contexts, I think hopefully I've shown very quickly, in a very rushed way perhaps, that the larger constructs of nation, the nation does cage certain social phenomena, experiences, and we can't actually easily avoid looking at that. But I think thinking relationally about these intersection inequalities, but also mutual perceptions and misrecognitions, allows us to see how a phenomenon such as gendered violence is not tackled. The policies don't work, really. What is going on is that you have paternalism on the one hand and securitization on the other as the solutions to this problem of gendered violence. Okay, so I can pretty much end here. I think that my I come back to this point that we need to think a little bit more in a more complicated way about things like nation state and global, or the nation, national, and the global. Think in more complicated ways about space and scale. And I know geographers in the room will say we're already doing that, but you know the fact is that actually a kind of relational sociology that thinks about the kind of that sort of complicates these categories rather than saying let's avoid them altogether. Let's rush from nation to global, or global to something else transnational. Is doesn't necessarily allow us to get a kind of purchase on the kind of social phenomena and the reproduction of violence in this case that we've been talking about. Okay, I think that's it. Thank you very much. I think I'm ending on time.